It's that time of year again. We've got you covered with a new safeguarding refresher course for the academic year 2022 to 2023. This is a free resource that is brought to you by the Safeguarding and Education team from Bristol City Council alongside the Keeping Bristol Safe partnership. As with any safeguarding training, it's good to ensure that you stay safe during this session. Here are a few considerations to help you achieve this. The content can be difficult and triggering. Talking about child abuse and safeguarding can be a sensitive topic. It may resonate with our personal experiences or trigger professional experiences for children and families we are currently working with. Please do give yourself space and time during and following the training. If you are in a training session with other colleagues, please also support each other. If someone needs some time out, do consider checking in to see if they are okay. If you're watching this live with colleagues, do be mindful of confidentiality if you wish to talk about cases. Everyone has a right to a private life. Do anonymise cases. Imagine if it was your family that was being discussed. You may not be very happy that your family circumstances were discussed during a team training session. Respect each other's views. This is meant to be a safe learning environment. We will have different backgrounds, values and beliefs. If you disagree with someone, try not to make it personal and consider their truths, as we'd want others to consider ours. Please minimise distractions if this is a live session. Timekeeping. Designated safeguarding leads or training facilitators, you may wish to pause the video at this point to agree break times and when you expect to finish. For a good learning experience, it is important you feel comfortable to ask questions, although be mindful, if someone doesn't know the answer, they may need to get back to you. It is anticipated that you're likely to be watching this session at the beginning of the academic year. You've probably just come back from a lovely break and getting back into the swing of things. You may have had very repetitive safeguarding training in previous years. Some of you may already be reminiscing about that glass of wine you may have been indulging in when you didn't have to get up in the mornings. If you are watching this in the morning, shame on you. It's way too early. However, we sincerely hope that our objectives and materials will engage you and resonate with your start of term energy. The aims of this training are to refresh your safeguarding knowledge, updates on key changes that will affect your work. There have been quite a few since the last training. Don't worry if you don't get them the first time round, you can always re-watch the video. Be able to apply these in the context of your day-to-day work. Reading sometimes when you're told to do it is very different to having time to reflect on this in a protected environment. Do use this session to reflect on how you can implement changes in your roles. Here are our objectives, what we want to cover in this year's session. Refresh on your safeguarding knowledge, looking at topical issues, looking at what's coming over the hill in terms of key changes in guidance and policy and how this might impact on your work. One of the key changes in keeping children safe in education in 2022 is the strengthening of the application of the Equality and Human Rights Acts within our safeguarding practice. Low-level concerns. This is not new to keeping children safe in education this year, but we do want to consider the well-being aspect of keeping yourself safe. We will focus on supporting each other and to avoid low-level concerns impacting on your work. You will have different members of the Safeguarding and Education team narrating some of the objectives just to mix it up a little for you.
This section is designed to be a refresher. Maybe not quite as refreshing as a cold drink on one of those hot sunny days in the summer, but a chance to revive all the safeguarding knowledge you have. If you haven't had basic safeguarding awareness training or feel you need to brush up on it, please speak to your designated safeguarding lead. You can also use this QR code to direct you to the Safer Schools app, which has free safeguarding awareness training, and you can print off a certificate if required. As a warm-up exercise, with the person next to you or in groups, identify as many examples as possible of harm that children and young people may experience online. Please pause the video for 2 minutes for a discussion. In true Blue Peter style, here's a list we made earlier, but please remember this isn't an exhaustive list. Did you identify any other potential online harms that we didn't think of? Please pause the video for feedback. The range of online harms we've just discussed could be categorised into the 4 C's. This is how it's referenced in Keeping Children Safe in Education and might be easier to remember. Content. This means being exposed to illegal, inappropriate or harmful content. For example, pornography, fake news, racism, misogyny, self-harm, suicide, anti-Semitism, radicalisation and extremism. Contact. This means being subjected to harmful online interaction with other users. For example, peer-to-peer pressure, commercial advertising, and adults posing as children or young adults with the intention to groom or exploit them for sexual, criminal, financial or other purposes. Conduct. This means online behaviour that increases the likelihood of or causes harm. For example, making, sending and receiving explicit images, which includes consensual and non-consensual sharing of nudes and semi-nudes and or pornography, sharing other explicit images and online bullying. Commerce. This means risks such as online gambling, inappropriate advertising, phishing and or financial scams. If you feel your students or staff are at risk, please report it to the Anti-Phishing Working Group at apwg.org. Obviously, there are concerns about potential online harms, but there are also benefits to using technology safely and embracing a connected world. Don't chuck the baby out with the bathwater. Say what? Project Evolve is a free online toolkit from the South West Grid for Learning, which can help support children to be safe online. The project highlights that we live in a connected world online now, and it's important not to be risk averse. It's about empowering children and young people to use technology safely. Please pause the video and click on the link in the description below to play the Project Evolve clip. Thinking of positives online, here's a few examples of some wellbeing apps from internetmatters.org. There's a whole page of useful apps for children that we recommend you have a look at. You can use the QR code here, or the link will be in the description below. Moving on now, we're going to explore extrafamilial harm. Extrafamilial harm is the harm that children and young people experience beyond their families. With the person next to you, or in groups, have a discussion for a couple of minutes about the types of extrafamilial harm that young people might experience. Please pause the video for 2 minutes for a discussion. Here are the forms of extrafamilial harm that we came up with. Child-on-child abuse, which has previously been referred to as peer-on-peer abuse. What's listed there on the slide is straight from Keeping Children Safe in Education 2022. Abuse in intimate relationships is in bold to highlight that it's new this year and to ensure that we recognise that it should be taken seriously and is a form of child-on-child abuse. Serious youth violence. Unfortunately, this is prevalent in Bristol at the moment. Since the beginning of 2020, there have been 11 rapid reviews forming part of local child safeguarding practice reviews following incidents of serious harm that children and young people have experienced. When considering serious youth violence, it's also important to think of the impact on wider family, for example, a young person's siblings. Radicalisation. You're probably aware of your prevent duty, but this is also about the potential for children to be groomed online, in the local community, or even within their wider networks. Child exploitation. You're probably familiar with the terms child criminal exploitation and child sexual exploitation, but we need to be mindful that children can experience multiple forms of harm at the same time, and those vulnerable to one can be vulnerable to others. In all cases of extrafamilial harm, education is consistently seen as a protective factor, particularly in terms of keeping children and young people engaged in learning. Thinking now about children sharing their concerns, why do you think they might want to do this anonymously? In your pairs or groups, discuss for a couple of minutes why a child might wish to report something anonymously. Please pause the video for 2 minutes for a discussion. Here are some thoughts we had. They might be worried about being seen reporting something. They might fear being seen as a snitch, which could in turn lead to isolation. They might fear retribution, or that things could get worse for them. Embarrassment. They might not feel comfortable talking about what's worrying them, especially if it's a sensitive or perceived taboo topic, such as sex and relationships. Shame. They might be worried about a judgment being made against them. Cultural and identity issues. This could be about who a child feels most comfortable talking to. There's a tendency to think about race when we talk about culture, but it's important to remember that it might involve different perceived groups within the school community. For example, a child who's popular might not want to make a disclosure because they might think they'll lose social status within their peer group. Another example could be that a child might not want to talk to a person of a different gender. Lack of trust or confidence in adults around them. It could be that the child or their friend has previously had a negative experience of sharing concerns. Research shows that children attempt to disclose multiple times before an adult acts on it. The fear of not being believed. Unfortunately, this can be a huge barrier for young people. Ultimately, you need to ensure that your systems for children being able to share their worries are robust enough to inspire confidence and meet the needs of your diverse community. Now we're going to reflect on our use of language and consider our practice in relation to statutory changes. The language we use in our record keeping can really impact on the way we treat and respond to children and young people. This quote from Descartes is in recognition that the language we use may define and shape how others perceive us in the future, as well as having an impact on our own identities. We're going to do an exercise to help reflect on how our use of language can impact on a child. Please divide your group so that both following topics can be discussed. Keeping Children Safe in Education 2022 uses the term child on child instead of peer on peer. One set of groups. Please discuss the impact of using the term child on child versus peer on peer. For the other half of the room, please discuss the impact of using the terms victim and perpetrator versus the names of the children involved and what happened. Please pause the video for 5 to 10 minutes for discussion and then allow time for feedback. The term peer on peer versus child on child. This has been changed in statutory guidance because children identified as having harmed another child tend to be adultified and criminalised. Referring to them specifically as a child highlights their vulnerability and potentially unmet needs. This might support further assessment of their needs or identify additional safeguarding concerns. The term peer on peer could also imply equality when there may be an imbalance of power, age, or ability. The words victim and perpetrator imply judgment when no investigation has occurred. If you're creating a safety plan for two children, imagine what the parents' view of their child being labelled a perpetrator would be. How would you feel if a child within your family was referred to as a perpetrator? It can also affect a child's own self-confidence and self-esteem if labelled a perpetrator. It's a weighted judgment that can impact on their sense of identity, of belonging. They might not want to come into school, which could then lead to isolation. If I called you a perpetrator, how would you feel? Probably not happy about it. Apply that thinking when you decide what language to use with children and their families and in your record keeping. It's also important to recognise that today's victim could be tomorrow's perpetrator and vice versa. This type of labelling can shape other professionals' perception of a child, which could increase the potential of becoming risk-averse, impacting on the support that child receives and ultimately on their life chances. Often support is there for the perceived victim, but not for those who have allegedly harmed. For example, professionals are likely to refer to social care regarding a perceived victim, but are less likely to refer for the child who has allegedly caused harm. Keeping Children Safe in Education uses the sentiment that there's a time and place for this language, and that the terms victim and perpetrator are used in the guidance to aid interpretation, but we need to think very carefully when using it in recording or with children and families. Okay, on to our next objective. What's that coming over the hill? There's lots of policy and papers coming out that will influence your work around safeguarding and keeping learners safe. So, Can anyone name the song and/or the band? I'll give you 10 seconds. So, did anyone get it? Well done if you did. If it's just on the tip of your tongue, I'll put you out of your misery. The song is Monster by The Automatic. Extra points for anyone who wants to do a rendition. Don't worry, I'm not about to sing at you, but if anyone did, well done, and can everyone give them a round of applause?
The school's white paper was published earlier on in the year, back in March. This is what will form the basis of our next Education Act. The document is called Opportunity for All, Strong Schools with Great Teachers for Your Child. The main points of this document are that all schools will be converted into academies, with councils being able to create a multi-academy trust for maintained settings. That there will be a register for electively home-educated children. This will enable local authorities to have a greater oversight in the role in safeguarding for these learners. The paper aims to ensure that children who are not in school receive good quality education and highlights recovery for education from the impact of the pandemic. Many of you have already noticed the increased volume of vulnerabilities from children and families who live in your communities. It will be interesting to see how the government continues to support the long-term impact of the pandemic and the lockdown has had. The paper also highlights that the system for supporting children with special educational needs and disabilities, or SEND system if we're using acronyms, needs reviewing, and that statutory agencies need to work together to improve attendance. This is not just an education issue. It is recognised that there may be systemic stresses that can impact on school attendance. This highlights that different agencies will need to work together to address the concerns. Schools alone cannot solve society's issues. We will be looking at 4 documents that will impact on your various roles in safeguarding children and young people. The first, Keeping Children Safe in Education 2022. This is effective from the 1st of September, working together to improve school attendance. This also comes into effect this September, making attendance everybody's business. The SEND Review. Right support, right place, right time. This has recently closed to public consultation this summer. Keep an eye out on how this will shape any changes in the system to support those with special educational needs and disabilities. And finally, the independent review of children's social care, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to ensure that the system is set up, resourced and operating in the best possible way to keep children and young people safe and ensure that they can enjoy their lives and full potential. We will go into all of these in more detail and help you consider how this will impact on your practice. Whilst there are some parts that you may be required to read, we are hopefully going to make it a bit easier for you to engage with the content and think about how this applies to you and your work. Good old Keeping Children Safe in Education. You should all be familiar with previous iterations of this document. Here are a few points that will help you consider some of the changes in the document without reading the whole thing. As mentioned earlier, the discourse of peer-on-peer has been changed to child-on-child in relation to statutory duties in preventing and responding to incidents of harmful sexualised behaviours such as sexual violence and sexual harassment. There is new statutory guidance around tackling domestic abuse and a new application of the statutory guidance to tackle forced marriage for non-statutory agencies, which includes education. These are referenced in Annex B. This next point may apply to some of you in the audience. It is now a statutory requirement for all governors to have appropriate safeguarding training. This training should equip those in governing roles with the knowledge to provide strategic challenge to test and assure themselves that safeguarding policies and procedures in place in schools and colleges are effective and support the delivery of a robust whole school approach to safeguarding. Previously, safeguarding training was advised just for the safeguarding governor, but responsibilities in Part 2 of this statutory guidance applies to the whole governing body, not just the safeguarding governor and DSL. After all, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. Adherence to equality and human rights legislation. We will discuss these in more detail later on. Senior leaders will now consider online checks for recruitment. Schools are now advised to search for publicly available information as part of their safer recruitment process. Those of you who are avid social media users, it might be worth looking at your privacy settings and making sure that your online footprint is protected. There have been further developments of the low-level concerns process. Last academic year, this was introduced as a statutory consideration. I will explore what this can look like in practice later on. Designated safeguarding leads now have to be aware of the role of an appropriate adult. This was following a local safeguarding practice review in Hackney regarding a child referred to as Child Q. Don't worry if you haven't heard about it, we're going to explore their story later on in the training. So, just to test your knowledge, what part of keeping children safe in education should all staff read? You've got 10 seconds to call out your answers. I'm hoping you said Part 1, Annex B if you work directly with children. If there is anyone who doesn't work directly with children, there is the option to read Annex A. Next, we have working together to improve school attendance, applicable from the 1st of September. It is not statutory this year, but it will become statutory next academic year, so all colleagues need to be aware of it. Here are the main points. The document is highlighting that improving attendance is everybody's business. It cannot solely be the responsibility of a single member of staff or organisation. It must be a concerted effort across all teaching and non-teaching staff in the school, the trust or governing body. More significantly, this applies to other statutory agencies beyond education. This includes social care, the police and health, so that it is not just seen as an educational issue. Attendance should be linked with promoting the best educational outcomes for learners, such as their attainment and achievements, and just as importantly to ensure that they feel included and that they feel like they belong, to support their well-being and support them to make them feel like they can make a positive contribution. Research has shown correlations between regular absence from school and extrafamilial harms. Statistics generally show 90% of young offenders had persistently been absent from school, and 83% of young knife possession offenders have been persistently absent in at least one of their 5 years of study. We must recognise that children missing education can be a warning sign of a range of safeguarding concerns. For the most vulnerable learners, regular school attendance is an important protective factor, allowing for their needs to be identified and support provided. In groups or pairs, take 5 to 10 minutes to discuss what you do in your role to contribute towards good school attendance. Designated safeguarding leads, please pause the video to allow time for discussions. Depending on your role, it could range from site security, taking the register, to talking about good attendance with your families. Don't forget, all of you, regardless of your roles, could be that member of staff who makes school a safe place for learners. This doesn't take much more than just being friendly, developing your relationships. In terms of more formal approaches, don't forget you should have all read your own settings procedures for children who go missing from education. The SEN review was published back in March. It sets out the government's findings and proposals to ensure the system offers children and young people the opportunity to thrive, have access to the right support, and fulfil their full potentials. The review have found the following challenges. Many children and families did not have a positive experience of navigating the system. Outcomes were consistently worse for those with special educational needs and disabilities than that of their peers in every measure. And whilst there's been continuing investment, it's just not financially sustainable. Again, in pairs or groups, please take 5 to 10 minutes to reflect on why children with special educational needs and disabilities are overrepresented in cases of abuse and neglect. Designated safeguarding leads, please pause the video to allow time for discussions. It should be recognised that there are some learners that have identified diagnosed needs, but equally there are some who have needs that have not been recognised or assessed. Sometimes this is due to systemic inequality and access to resource. Hopefully you were able to discuss vulnerabilities such as neurodiversities that can lead to a difference in understanding, speech and language can indicate a difficulty in communicating experiences, and that children with additional needs are usually not able to access help or support as easily as systems for reporting concerns and worries are not always differentiated. Learners with diagnosed or undiagnosed needs may struggle to articulate or even communicate their experiences of harm and show and demonstrate these through their behaviours. Sometimes, if we do not consider the equality or human rights needs of these learners, we interpret or label these behaviours as naughty. Professionals' lack of competency around trying to understand behaviours can compound a child's experiences as we end up sanctioning them when we should be offering them support. The government's manifesto committed to reviewing the children's social care system to make sure that children and young people get the support they need. The review that was launched back in March 2021 prioritised hearing the voices of children, young people and adults that have received the help or support of a social worker or who have care experience. The review found that we currently have a system that is increasingly skewed to crisis intervention, with outcomes for children that continue to be unacceptably poor and is more and more expensive to fund. I'd hope that you would agree that what we need is a system that provides intensive help to families in crisis, acts decisively in response to abuse, unlocks the potential of wider family networks to raise children, puts lifelong loving relationships at the heart of the care system and lays the foundations for a good life for those who have been in care. Achieving this starts with recognising that it is loving relationships that hold the solutions for children and families overcoming adversity. Whilst relationships are rich and organic, children's social care can be rigid and linear. Rather than drawing on and supporting family and the community, the system too often tries to replace organic bonds and relationships with professionals and services. In Bristol, we aren't afraid to love. Our corporate parenting strategy has centred on the lived experiences of our children and young people and has reinforced the idea that we need to demonstrate genuine and effective care rather than being stoic and unresponsive. Multi-agency safeguarding arrangements should be clarified to put beyond doubt their strategic role, supported by improved accountability, learning and transparency. In too many places, the contribution and voice of education is missing from partnership arrangements, and so schools should be included as a statutory safeguarding partner within the local safeguarding partnership. Hopefully the government accepts the review's recommendations to make education a statutory agency rather than a relevant agency, to ensure that colleagues are invited to the table around strategic and operational safeguarding of children and their families. What is the local safeguarding partnership in Bristol called? Shout out if you know the answer. You have 10 seconds. Those of you who said the Keeping Bristol Safe partnership, you are correct. Hopefully you are familiar with the partnership if you and your setting are compliant with keeping children safe in education. These replaced local safeguarding children's boards back in 2018 to promote multi-agency working and practice on a local basis. Currently, 3 statutory partners, the local authority, the NHS Integrated Care System and the local police constabulary have joint responsibilities to support the safeguarding arrangements within a local authority. All education settings are relevant agencies within that partnership. We all have to do our part to safeguard the children within our local authority. In Bristol, we have also integrated the statutory boards for adult and safer communities on the understanding that vulnerable children and young people often have vulnerable parents and carers, and that vulnerable families can often live in vulnerable communities. When a child has been seriously harmed or killed due to abuse or neglect, the local safeguarding partnership must conduct a child safeguarding practice review. These are to consider whether there are any lessons that can be learned systemically around the effectiveness of safeguarding arrangements or practice. We are now going to consider a national review that you may have heard in the news about the stories of Arthur Lavinia Hughes and Star Hobson. We won't go over their stories as they've been covered extensively in the national press, but we will look at the key learning points from the review. We need to think family. Often our professional experiences can be limited by just engaging with those with parental responsibility. It is key to consider the impact of others who may have close relationships with the child as family. Whilst we respect those with parental responsibility, it is also important to respect that family can come in all shapes and sizes, and not all families are blood related. Children affected by parental offending, or CAPO. This is a category within keeping children safe in education as a group who may benefit from early help due to increased vulnerability. The harm and vulnerability that these children can experience is often hidden due to the shame and stigma attached with having a family member who's been involved in or incarcerated into the criminal justice system. Reporting and responding to visible injuries. Hopefully you are familiar with what to do in your role in terms of recording and reporting, such as use of descriptive words and the use of body maps. Whilst attempting, do not take photos or pictures of injuries on your devices. You could potentially disrupt statutory child protection procedures because an assessment could be made from your picture rather than trying to get an account of a child's day-to-day life experiences. If photographic evidence is required, this should be done by a statutory agency. It was recommended that an early help office should be available before or during and after completion of any child and family assessment by Children's Social Care. This often helps facilitate a whole family approach where a wider extended family and neighbourhood networks are involved in providing support to vulnerable young parents. Clarification of the remit of local early help services, such as education settings, are often instrumental in being able to ensure longer lasting support is available for families. Managing risk effectively. Negative judgments were made about familial concerns in the case of Arthur Lavinia Hughes. Decisions not to proceed with an assessment were based on assumptions that the family's concerns were perceived to be malicious. It is recommended an assessment should be conducted to test this hypothesis, including talking to the referrer and having agreement and oversight with an appropriate manager. Risk assessment should be genuinely multi-agency informed, which includes listening to family and friends. The review calls to increase direct work with children experiencing harm to be able to establish their day-to-day life experiences and their voices. Often there are many factors which can inhibit the voice of the child. Fear, communication barriers, not having the language to talk about their experiences, but professional and familial expertise can and should be used to consider what a child's day-to-day life experiences through use of their observations. Again, a call for education to be considered a statutory agency. Currently, with their status as a relevant agency, there are concerns with consistency where some schools are being kept out of discussions and not fed back outcomes of important meetings. Schools, colleges and other educational settings have a pivotal role to play in protecting children. In seeing children every day, they're in a unique position to identify concerns early, to recognise when concerns are escalating and to share key information with safeguarding partners. Domestic abuse features in both Arthur's and Starr's respective stories. There have been developments in legislation and guidance in the last couple of years. The new Domestic Abuse Act 2021 last year and Domestic Abuse Statutory Guidance 2022, which was published this summer. The statutory guidance tells us how to implement the Act in practice when we manage cases. The main developments for you to consider are as follows. Children are now considered as victims in their own rights. This protects a minimum standard in recognising that the witnessing or being exposed to the harm of others now ensures that a child's needs have to be considered each and every time professionals respond to an incident of domestic abuse. Often professional safeguarding responses would focus on the adult victim over the child. This now ensures that children who are exposed to abuse are considered on an equal footing. Control and coercion. These are enshrined in law as considerations of identifying and responding to domestic abuse. Are you able to recognise them? Are you able to understand the long-term harm it can have on a victim? There is a BBC Three documentary called Is This Coercive Control that we recommend that you watch. Do get your skates on though, this is due to be removed from the website in October 2022. To access this, either Google it or click on the link in the description below. The main point of consideration for education colleagues is that you are notified when a learner has experienced domestic abuse and there has been police involvement. In Bristol, we share when an incident has happened, so when a child comes into your classroom the next day, dysregulated and maybe displaying their trauma through their behaviour, you can consider a nurturing trauma-informed response, rather than providing a sanction or a punishment. The guidance also reiterates that when delivering relationship, sex and health education, that there is no right to withdraw children from the being safe lessons and materials, of which domestic abuse will be part of. This applies to both primary and secondary settings. So, one common theme throughout the guidance and the child safeguarding practice reviews is the need to increase and develop professional curiosity. Hopefully this is not an alien concept to you. Spend 5 to 10 minutes talking or reflecting in your groups around what professional curiosity actually looks like. Designated safeguarding leads, please pause the video to allow time for discussions. So here are some we came up with earlier. Make sure you check in with the child. Have interested conversations. Ask, are you okay? What's going on for you right now? How are you today? Trust your gut feelings. Many of you have years of experience working directly with children and young people. Often you can call on your gut feelings informed by your experience that something isn't quite right. The trick is to be able to try and articulate these. Offer your observations and consider the presentation of the child. We are told to be factual in our record keeping. Yes, that is important. However, don't forget what you see. Whilst arguably subjective, is likely to be well informed by your professional experiences and judgments. You can offer your professional opinions, but make sure you own them and give yourself permission to be wrong. You can always add a line in your record keeping using the phrase, "in my professional opinion." I might be wrong, but this is what I think might be happening for the child. This is a good way to attempt to articulate your gut instinct without compromising on the factual information that you have also provided. Share and talk with colleagues. Who else may be working with the child? If you need to get a sense check, speak to your designated safeguarding lead. A problem shared is a problem halved. Sometimes you may all hold a different piece of the jigsaw puzzle, which may help illustrate a bigger picture. On to our next objective. If you haven't had a break yet, now's a good time to do so. Please just pause the video and resume when you're ready. Equality, human rights, and safeguarding. It is likely that many of you already have experience with these topics, but they have had a renewed standing within the newest version of Keeping Children Safe in Education. This section will help you consider these legal duties in line with your safeguarding responsibilities. The next section will consider how equalities and human rights can come together, using some examples for you to reflect on your practice. Equality and human rights legislation. Legislation refers to the law. We should be working within the law at all times, as they help protect us and keep us safe. When we talk about the Equality Act 2010, this translates into working in a way which is anti-discriminatory. The law states that in your role you cannot discriminate against someone based on their protected characteristics. Please pause the video for 2 minutes to identify what are considered protected characteristics. Protected characteristics covered by the Equality Act are age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion or belief, sex, and sexual orientation. In Bristol, we have a 50-year plan that all organisations and professionals are working towards. This is called the One City Plan. As part of the plan, we have 2 charters that we ask all professionals who work with children to know and use. These are the Children's Charter and the Equality Charter. These ensure that we're all on the same page and being able to champion every child's needs and rights, regardless of who they are, where they come from, and what their needs may be. When we talk about human rights laws, we are referring to the need to practice in an anti-oppressive manner. We have various pieces of legislation to be mindful of. The United Convention of the Rights of the Child. These are global rights for every child that lives in a country that has adopted it. Working in education, it is highly likely that you've already encountered this piece of legislation already. We also have continental legislation called the European Convention on Human Rights, which applies to member states of the Council of Europe. Article 1 of the European Convention on Human Rights states that every nation within Europe should have their own version of this legislation. Our version in the UK is the Human Rights Act 1998. The UK are still part of this legislation despite Brexit and offers a layer of protection for those who may require it. Equalities and human rights should be considered together. Many of you are familiar with the need not to discriminate, but you may not be as readily able to reflect on your perceived professional powers and privileges, which can impact on a child or family's experience of working with you as an educational professional. Let's consider the case of Child Q. This case highlights where issues around discrimination and oppression happen in congruence. Many of you may have heard about this case, which was prevalent in the media this year. The story is about a black female child of secondary school age who was strip searched by female police officers from the Metropolitan Police Services. The search, which involved the exposure of Child Q's intimate body parts, took place on school premises, without an appropriate adult present and with the knowledge that Child Q was menstruating. The case has been subject to a local child safeguarding practice review from the City of Hackney Children's Partnership. Key points from this learning are: escalation of disproportionate interventions. There is a concern that due to the child's protective characteristics, there were biases which actively took action to assume culpability and guilt without considering vulnerability, human rights, and welfare of the child as a priority. There was a consideration that the police did not consistently manage to record ethnicity against specific interventions. This can lead to a lack of transparency without significant resource to review cases to ensure anti-discriminatory practice. Safeguarding versus sanctions. The tone in government guidance largely reflects a discourse which promotes discipline over safeguarding, often using outdated terminology. It is highlighted that systemically schools in England are working to guidance which are likely to lead to frontline staff down a path around managing behaviour without consideration for the risk of extrafamilial harms, such as the risk of peer pressure or child exploitation. The review recommended that the government reviews guidance which makes explicit safeguarding references that might assist with practice on helping and protecting children rather than focusing on punishment or seeking culpability. The review found the process around the use of an appropriate adult and communication around this was not clear. We need to consider whether a power imbalance impacted on this. This quote from the review illustrates this further and what we need to do moving forward. School staff deferred to the authority of the police on their arrival at school. They should have been more challenging to the police, seeking clarity about their actions they intended to take. All practitioners need to be mindful of their duties to uphold the best interests of children. So a term that has been used consistently to describe why this may have happened is adultification. But what is it? Pause the video for 5 minutes to allow colleagues to give their definitions. According to Davis and Marsh 2020, the concept of adultification is where notions of innocence and vulnerability are not afforded to certain children. In this case, it is relating to black children. This is determined by people and institutions who hold power over children and young people. When adultification occurs outside the home, it is always founded within discrimination and bias. There are various definitions of adultification. All relate to a child's personal characteristics, socio-economic influences, and lived experiences. Regardless of the context in which adultification takes place, the impact results in children's rights being either diminished or overlooked. When it comes to the need to reflect on anti-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practice when you work with people, we all like to think that we may already be doing this, and to a large extent you already are. However, Many of you who identify as progressive or woke fall into the trap of complacency and expect others to do the learning. It is very easy to point the finger and expect someone else to change their behaviours. But if you point your finger, how many more are pointing back at you? One tool which can assist us to reflect on developing anti-oppressive and anti-discriminatory practice is the Social Graces tool. Developed by John Burnham et al. Back in 1992, this is a mnemonic to help us remember some key concepts that influence our personal and social identities. These are gender, geography, race, religion, age, ability, appearance, class, culture, ethnicity, education, employment, sexuality, sexual orientation, and spirituality. This tool has the potential to help you fight prejudice, to acknowledge privilege and redistribute power by allowing you to acknowledge how each grace can either enable or disable you and whoever you may be speaking to. It is possible and probable that you are likely to experience both enablement and disablement at the same time and intersectionality across different domains. You can use the graces to acknowledge and respect other people's experiences, which can encourage connections. This is a great way to have a constructive conversation about others' experiences without leaning into the fragilities of defending your privileges. You can also use it to challenge your own potential assumptions and biases of another person's reality or truth, and what it may be like to experience a space from their perspective. The Equality Act also has additional duties on public bodies. These are general duties which you may already be familiar with. These are to eliminate discrimination, advance equality of opportunity, and foster good relations between different people when carrying out their activities. There are also more technical duties for all state-funded settings to implement. These are to have and publicise an equality statement that's reviewed on an annual basis, and equality objectives reviewed at least every 4 years. Often these are written by the head teacher and/or a member of the senior leadership team. Good practice would ensure that these are co-constructed and that every member of staff are aware of and working actively towards achieving these. It may be a good idea for designated safeguarding leads, principals or head teachers to share your value statement and objectives at this point if you haven't already done so. Please pause the video to discuss for 10 to 15 minutes. 1. Did you know about your own setting statement and objectives? And 2. Using your social graces, how can you exercise your objectives within your role? Keeping Children Safe in Education 2022 this year has introduced the need to consider the vulnerability of LGBTQ+ learners. You will notice that different documents and organisations will reference a different acronym. The letters that you may encounter stand for L for lesbian, G for gay, B bisexual, T for trans, Q for queer, often a reclamation of the slur, and or questioning, for those who are not sure of what their sexuality is. The plus refers to a wide range of sexuality and gender identities which are not always referenced. Sometimes there are references to I, intersex, and A, for asexual. Keeping Children Safe in Education states the following. The fact that a child or young person may be LGBT is not itself an inherent risk factor for harm. However, children who are LGBT can be targeted by other children. In some cases, a child who is perceived by other children to be LGBT, whether they are or not, can just be as vulnerable as children who identify as LGBT. Although it is disappointing that statutory guidance stops short of looking at wider harms that LGBTQ+ learners are vulnerable to beyond child-on-child harm, recent publications cite other reasons why LGBTQ+ communities are more vulnerable, beyond the harm they can experience from their peers, which can include how well LGBTQ+ children are enabled to feel that they're included and that they belong in their settings. The Just Like Us research last year highlighted only 58% of LGBTQ+ pupils have felt safe at school on a daily basis in the past 12 months, compared to 73% of non-LGBTQ+ pupils. Only a third of LGBTQ+ people say there is a clear process for reporting anti-LGBTQ+ bullying in their school. 48% had not seen any positive messaging about being LGBTQ+ from their school in the last 12 months. LGBTQ+ young people are 3 times more likely to self-harm and twice as likely to have depression, anxiety and panic attacks, as well as being lonely and worry about their mental health on a daily basis. LGBTQ+ young people, 68%, are twice as likely to contemplate suicide than their non-LGBTQ+ peers, which are only 29%. The Anna Freud Centre, in a report this year, has highlighted the unique challenges LGBTQ+ learners experience that leads to negative mental health. This can include fears of being outed, worries about being accepted by friends and family, and the impact of prejudice and discrimination. For local and lived experiences of LGBTQ+ young people in Bristol, Creative Youth Network put on the We the 33, a listening event that took place in July 2022. We the 33 is an event for young people in Bristol under the age of 25 who make up 33% of Bristol's population, who are not always afforded a platform for their voices to be heard. Please pause and click on the link in the description below to watch the video. Gender Identity 101. To quote Albert Einstein, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't understand it yourself. Recently, there's been a lot of trans exclusionary rhetoric within the media, which has led to hostility from those who act upon what they fear. Misinformation can lead to scaremongering and transphobia, which quite frankly has no place within our education system. We educate, we do not discriminate. Some of you may find talking about this topic more difficult, but please do approach it with an open mind, whether or not you would identify with these perceptions yourself. In being able to respect these concepts, you can make trans or non-binary or gender questioning children feel like they belong. This is essential to mitigating the harms that you have heard about in the previous slides. We will need to apply our social graces in understanding the lived experiences of trans, non-binary and or gender questioning learners with a view not to further discriminate or oppress them. An easily accessible resource is the Genderbread Person and associated guidance from Sam Killerman. This is a simple visual way to develop and understand gender identity. You can either Google this or click on the link in the description below. Let's test our knowledge. How do you define gender? Pause the video to have a quick discussion. Gender refers to who you think you are. In terms of your gender identity, it's all about how you think about yourself and how you internally interpret the chemistry that composes you, for example your hormone levels. Gender is also how you demonstrate who you are. This is also known as gender expression. Gender expression is all about how you demonstrate gender through the ways you act, dress, behave and interact, whether this is intentional or unintended. Gender is considered different to sex, but how do you define sex? Whilst it may be a favourite topic for some of you, we are not referring to sexual intercourse, but pause the video to have a discussion as to how sex can be defined in terms of gender identity. Sex refers to your biological characteristics you were born with, for example your genitalia, hormones and chromosomes. Biological female characteristics means having a vagina, ovaries, 2 X chromosomes and predominant estrogen. Biological male characteristics can include having testes, a penis, an XY chromosome configuration and predominant testosterone. And being intersex can be a combination of what has just been described. Even if you don't identify as trans, non-binary or gender fluid, some of you may already start feeling uncomfortable around the biological characteristics being used as a sole distinguishment of your gender. You may have genetic variants which means you are considered more or less masculine or feminine. What does the word cis mean? Pause the video to discuss. Being cisgendered is when your gender and sex align. where you identify and express your gender in a way which matches with your biological sex characteristics. For example, if someone is born with male reproductive organs and genitalia, he is very likely to be raised as a boy, identify as a man, and express himself in a masculine way. We call this identity cisgendered. Many are enabled by being cisgendered. However, if we do not recognise this privilege, we risk othering those who do not fit into the binary notion of sex or gender. We have already used the term a couple of times already, but how would you define the term non-binary? Pause the video to have a discussion. Those who are non-binary identify with gender as a spectrum rather than just a binary male or female. Those who identify with being non-binary do not necessarily deny their biological sex characteristics, but they are not comfortable with the socialization of gender to be either masculine or feminine. A person who is non-binary can choose to participate in masculine, feminine, or even neutral expressions of gender in their appearance, the way they choose to dress, wear their hair, or how they refer to themselves. Often those who identify as gender neutral or non-binary can be discriminated against and rejected from spaces where there are strong gendered identities, such as spaces where gender is highly valued and having high levels of masculinity or femininity. How do you define pronouns? Pause the video to have a discussion. Pronouns are how we like to be referred to in language to reflect our genders in conversations and or in writing about ourselves. These could be he, him, she, her, they, them, or sie, sie. The latter two can be used for those who are gender neutral or non-binary. Many of us don't like to get misgendered. Maybe you identify as female who has a deep voice and you get referred to as sir over the phone. Or maybe you identify as male and have a high voice and get referred to as miss. If you can resonate with this, it is important to recognise that assumptions of your gender and your fundamental identity can be triggering and upsetting. For those who are trans or gender neutral, this can often happen multiple times a day. Trans or transgender. How do you define this? Pause the video for a discussion. The term trans incorporates a range of identities transgressing social norms. This is an umbrella term to describe people whose gender is not the same as, or does not sit comfortably with the sex they were assigned to at birth. Trans people can identify as non-binary, but many strongly identify with the opposite gender to what they were born and raised as. Not every trans person will want to transition medically or physiologically, but may still like or benefit from ongoing support of some kind. It is important to acknowledge that trans does not indicate sexual attraction or sexual orientation. Now we have been through some of the basic gender identity terms, it is important, regardless of your own personal views, to recognise that children and young people, and even colleagues who may identify or express a non-binary or transgendered identity, have protected characteristics and human rights. Safeguarding is everybody's business. It is our role as professionals to ensure that we can respect and be inclusive for all children to help address and mitigate the disproportionate negative experiences that these children can be exposed to growing up. Now on to our final objective. We are very nearly there.
Low-level concerns and supporting each other. In this section, we are going to look at the importance of supporting our colleagues with their well-being, thinking about the importance of enabling and embedding a culture where all staff feel supported and empowered. This is in order to help us identify when a colleague may need support and ensure that we respond accordingly. We know that reporting and recording low-level concerns was introduced last year into keeping children safe in education. When we think about low-level concerns, sometimes it's easy to overlook factors which may be affecting our staff in their personal lives, perhaps causing low-level concerns to present at work. We should bear in mind that staff may need support, and we should think about what we can do to contribute to this both individually and as a setting. Let's start with a short quiz to test our understanding of low-level concerns. This is a quick-fire quiz. Question 1. Who do you share low-level concerns with? Please pause the video. And the answer? Keeping Children Safe in Education 2022 has changed the reporting of low-level concerns. It's for each setting to decide who the reports should go to. Question 2. Is it okay to treat one child more favourably than another? Please pause the video. We understand that sometimes it's difficult not to have a favourite, but you should ensure that you behave professionally and treat all children fairly. Remember, it's okay to treat children according to their needs and respond on an individualised basis if reasonable adjustments are required. Question 3. Is it okay to add ex-students onto your social media? Please pause the video. And the answer? No. Be mindful that it blurs your professional boundaries. We understand that you might have relationships beyond your role in education. You should disclose these to your designated safeguarding lead. And our final question, question 4. A colleague has made a racist remark. Is this a low-level concern? Please pause the video. And the answer? Yes. Consider the impact of their professional values within the wider setting and the community. It may be that the staff member requires support with further training or a reminder of their responsibilities under the Staff Code of Conduct. The behaviour should be challenged and a solution-focused approach adopted to support the staff member and others who may be impacted as well. Well done if you managed to answer some of those questions. You might even have got them all right. We hope that quick quiz gave you an opportunity to think about how the behaviour of a colleague could have an impact within your setting and how that might become a low-level concern, and it could identify a support need for that colleague. We're now going to look at a scenario where a change in a colleague's behaviour could be influenced by external circumstances. You suspect a colleague is experiencing control or coercion at home. What would make it easier for them to share a concern? Let's think about how easy or otherwise it may be to encourage an open dialogue within our setting. How do we enable our colleague to feel that they can share their situation? How do we support them to do so? What can we do to make staff feel better able to share their worries and concerns? Please pause the video for 5 to 10 minutes to enable discussions in small groups. Here are some of our thoughts. Our list is not exhaustive, and you may have plenty of other ideas and suggestions. Ask your colleagues if they're okay or what's happening for them. Give your colleagues a chance to talk. Provide a safe space and a listening ear. Don't force the issue, but don't be afraid to ask. You might be the first person they have spoken to, or the first person who has truly listened and offered support. Of course, we appreciate this is not always easy, as we are all busy people. Have information available that is accessible and visible to your staff. Have opportunities to talk. Thinking about these, do you have one-to-ones, supervision, peer support in place? Know the consequences of sharing a concern. Who's going to help you? What support is going to be offered to you? And how can you help your colleague to access that support? Promote allyship. Are there allies in your organisation? Have you identified a wellbeing champion for staff? Thinking about domestic abuse, why not see if you can find out about how to promote the White Ribbon campaign across your setting? White Ribbon UK is the leading charity engaging with men and boys to end violence against women. Have a nominated staff champion or values guardian. Do staff know who the nominated person to talk to is, such as the DSL, the head teacher, or a staff wellbeing champion? Ensure there are safe and welcoming spaces to have these conversations. Provide staff with empowerment through training and normalise conversations. If it impacts on practice, encourage and support them to share their worries and concerns with the nominated person. It may be that you can work with the senior leadership team to develop the support further around wellbeing for all staff. It's important to look after ourselves, and sometimes we forget to do that. Take a minute to scan the QR code on the screen and answer 5 questions to get some top tips and advice that work for you to support you with your well-being. Please pause the video for 5 minutes so staff can complete this. We hope that you picked up some useful tips, and if you've not had a chance to complete this, you will be able to access the app after this training. There is also a link on this slide to a service called Our Frontline. This is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week free service. It offers mental health and bereavement support for teachers. So before we watch our last video, thank you for joining us today. We hope that you found the training interesting and useful. Remember, you are important and valued staff members who all contribute to safeguarding children in your setting, whatever your role may be. Let's look at this video and think about how we can care for ourselves, and let's all make a plan to ensure we do so.
Please pause and click on the link in the description below to watch the video. Do stay in touch for more safeguarding and education resources, news and events. Whatever your role in education, we have something for you. You can follow us on Twitter @setbristol or visit our website at bristolsafeguardingineducation.org.